Robert Redford is nearing 90, but for him, a long life has felt more like a curse than a blessing. Behind the Hollywood glamour lies a haunting tale of tragedy, near-death experiences, and heartbreaking losses. From childhood illnesses to shattered relationships and devastating grief, Redford's life proves that even legends aren't spared from suffering. How have these hardships shaped the man he is today? Why has getting older become his biggest curse? What are the regrets he carries? The ones he'd do anything to take back if he could? Get the answers to these burning questions and more in this video. As a child, Robert Redford silently battled polio, a struggle few knew about. At 11, after overexerting himself in an ocean swim, he was bedridden for weeks. Though his case wasn't severe, it was the ever-present fear of polio that truly haunted him, a fear shared by every child in the 1940s. In a 2018 NPR interview, Redford spoke about how that fear shaped his childhood. Years later, in 2014, he directed a segment for Cathedrals of Culture, reflecting on the Salk Institute and how Jonas Salk's vaccine not only marked a scientific breakthrough, but the end of a silent, terrifying chapter in his life. Just when he believed that the Salk vaccine pushed all tragedies of his early life behind him, at just 18, Robert Redford faced another heartbreaking loss. His mother, Martha, died in 1955 at just 40 from a hemorrhage caused by a blood disorder after the stillbirth of her twin daughters. Losing her was painful, but what haunted him most was wondering what she might have seen in him had she lived longer. As a rebellious teenager, Redford didn't always make life easy for his mother, yet she never lost faith in him. She always believed he was destined for something special. Tragically, she passed away just 5 years before his screen debut. As he grew older, Redford often thought of her. In a deeply emotional moment before a star-filled audience, he admitted his deepest regret, taking her for granted and never getting the chance to thank her. He then, once again, brushed with deep grief when he lost his uncle, who had stepped in as a father figure during Robert's formative years. With his father, Charles Redford, working endless hours as a milkman, Robert found solace and guidance in his uncle David, an extraordinary man, both on the football field and in life. Their bond was forged through hours of perfecting football throws together. But fate wasn't kind. Tragedy struck when David enlisted in the army to fight in World War II and never made it home. In 1945, David was killed when the Jeep he was riding in was caught in enemy crossfire on a bridge in Luxembourg. In 2013, Redford reflected on the painful loss during an NPR interview, sharing that the way his family handled it was with silence. No one spoke about it, and there were no questions asked. The absence of open grief left a deep scar on him, as there was no room for mourning, only an unspoken rule to push forward, even when the weight of the loss felt unbearable. Redford's college years were marked by rebellion and self-destruction, shaped by the weight of his losses. After graduating from Van Nuys High School in 1954, where he was classmates with future stars like Natalie Wood and Don Drysdale, he earned a baseball scholarship to the University of Colorado. A promising pitcher, he joined the Kappa Sigma fraternity and worked at the popular bar and restaurant The Sink. But grief, likely intensified by his mother's death, led to a dangerous drinking habit that ultimately cost him his scholarship. His time at the University of Colorado was short-lived. After losing his scholarship, Redford sought solace in art, traveling to Florence and Paris to study painting before returning to the U.S. to pursue acting at New York's American Academy of Dramatic Arts. For Redford, life seemed to be falling into place by the end of the 1950s. He had just married his wife, Lola Van Wagenen, made his Broadway debut in Tall Story, and was embracing the joys of parenthood with the birth of their son, Scott. But just as everything seemed to be aligning, disaster struck again in November of 1959, when Scott was only 10 weeks old. His son tragically passed away from what would later be known as sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The loss devastated Redford. He was consumed by guilt, tormented by the belief that if only he had checked on his son earlier, he might have saved him. That moment of unimaginable pain would haunt him for the rest of his life. Just 3 years after losing his first son, Scott, Robert Redford faced the terrifying possibility of losing his second. In 1962, his son, David, was born prematurely with a condition that had already claimed President Kennedy's son. With just a 40% chance of survival, David battled hyaline membrane disease, his tiny lungs struggling to breathe and his life hanging by a thread. Miraculously, both David and Lola survived, but the relief Robert felt was fleeting. His family had narrowly escaped another devastating loss, yet the weight of past tragedies never truly lifted. Behind the Hollywood success was a life shaped by silent suffering, struggles hidden from the public, wounds carried in solitude. Robert, ever the protector, bore those burdens alone, shielding his loved ones from even more pain. In 1983, Robert Redford's world was torn apart again, this time by a tragedy that devastated his daughter, Shauna. Her boyfriend, Sid Wells, a journalism student at the University of Colorado, was brutally murdered, shot in the back of the head in his own apartment. His roommate, Thane Smika, became the prime suspect, but despite his arrest, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. 3 years later, Smika's abandoned car was found in Beverly Hills, sparking rumors he'd fled the country. The case was reopened in 2010, but Smika remains on the run, still at large. Redford, who stayed away from Sid's funeral to avoid the media frenzy, later admitted the unsolved murder still haunts him. For him, that dark chapter lingers. Robert Redford's life has been marked by one tragedy after another, and one of the saddest losses of all was the end of his marriage to Lola Van Wagenen after nearly 30 years of being together. In the 1980s, Redford and Lola seemed like the picture of a lasting marriage. They'd weathered the tragic loss of their first son, Scott, and raised 3 other children together. So, when they quietly separated in 1985, it felt like a deep betrayal of the love they had built. Redford, always a loyal husband, was often misunderstood. His charm was misinterpreted as arrogance. Jane Fonda, who once thought she was in love with him, admitted his moods made him hard to approach, but spoke fondly of his goodness beneath the brooding exterior. As an actor, his friendship that meant so much. Though he rarely speaks of his pain, he has shared his grief in a moving tribute for Turner Classic Movies and appeared in the 2020 HBO documentary What Remains Behind, paying homage to the woman whose loss continues to haunt him. Perhaps one of the cruelest burdens of Robert's old age is watching his friends pass, one by one. Robert Redford and Paul Newman shared a friendship that ran deeper than just their legendary on-screen partnership in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting. Over the years, their bond grew stronger, rooted in shared political and social values, and a mutual respect that transcended Hollywood's glitz. But in 2008, that bond was shattered when Newman lost his battle with cancer. Redford was left to mourn the loss of his closest friend, a friendship that had defined their careers and lives. For him, the pain of that loss still lingers, a reminder of a connection that will never be replaced. As a father, Redford believed that no parent should ever have to bury their child, let alone 2. Yet in October 2020, Redford and his ex-wife Lola faced the devastating loss of their son, James Redford, who passed away from liver cancer at the age of just 58. James, born 3 years after the death of his infant brother, Scott, had struggled with liver issues throughout his life. He underwent a liver transplant in 1993 and later founded an institute to raise awareness about the procedure. But in 2019, while waiting for a second transplant, James received a heartbreaking diagnosis of bile duct cancer. A year later, despite his fight, he succumbed to the illness. In the wake of his son's death, Robert Redford mourned privately with his family, asking for the space to grieve in peace. Now almost 90, Robert Redford is blessed with a long life that many dream of, but with that blessing comes a life filled with tragedies and painful goodbyes.